This video was sponsored by JLCPCB. The current setup consists of my AR glasses, micro display driver board, mini HDMI converter, and gyro core. This is a pretty good setup, but there are a couple of drawbacks. Mainly the freeboard stackup takes quite a lot of space inside the 3D printed frame. Micro display driver board and HDMI converter as is are not very suitable for small AR devices, since they're almost square. Instead they should be slim but elongated. Current setup also requires the use of two separate cables, HDMI for the image and micro USB for the gyro data. It may not sound like a big deal, but two cables on one side of the glasses can make it super difficult to use them. That's why I'm working on the new mainboard for my AR projects. The idea is to use a cheap Chinese USB-C dock as base template. This would pretty much get rid of the multiple cable problem, since I would replace them with one USB-C cable for all electronic parts. Just like in other projects, I've started by recreating whole Chinese board trace by trace in Fusion. All of the original connections are there. It's pretty much one-to-one copy. Purchasing the prototype boards are super easy. You just generate the Gerber files in Fusion. You can also get the ready to upload Gerber files on my Patreon. And now you just upload the Gerber files to JLCPCB and click order. It's super easy and I use the services all of the time. Here you can see the board preview before ordering. You can also change the color, thickness and stuff like that. When you're ready, just click add to cart and that's it. The board should arrive at your house in about 8 days. As always, the package arrived relatively quickly. I've actually ordered two versions of this board, the 0.1 and 0.11. I'm going to solder the new one first, and if it turns out it doesn't work, then I will simply solder the solder one. Of course, all of the boards I order come to me packaged very safely, as you can probably tell. The one you see on the screen is the 0.11, it's the more refined version in comparison to 0.1. The older one had some of the solder pads and polygons hand-drawn, which means it looked a bit more crude. But on the other hand, it was closer to the original Chinese board. The 0.11 has all of the solder pads made just like they should be, and ground polygons are automatically generated. The 0.1 version actually arrived in separate package along with the other board meant for different video. As I've said before, it won't be used for now, so let's solder the 0.11. Just like before, I will be transferring all of the components from the original board. Of course I have all of them read and mapped out in case I would like to build it from ground up. I start the soldering process by coating the empty board with flux. Flux makes it super easy to solder all of this stuff. And now I will add solder to all of the pads, since I will be using hot air for soldering. Any excess amount of solder can be later removed with the solder pump, so don't worry if you've ever done it. Here you can see the board with all of its pads covered in solder. There is some excess solder, but as I've mentioned, it can be removed with solder pump. It's also covered in solder gunk, but that can be cleaned with alcohol. Here's my component transferring setup. There's the original board on the right and my custom recreation on the left. I will now use the hot air station to safely transfer all of the components. The top side of the board is now finished, which means I can now flip it and do the other side. The super fragile components like connectors and USB wires have to be soldered last, as those are very non-heat resistant. I will most likely get rid of the wires in future version and replace it with regular USB-C connector. I've actually managed to solder the original wires to my board, but it was a huge pain in the ass to do so, as those are super fragile. With the wires done, it's time to solder the connectors. The connectors are fairly easy to solder, since those are regular SMD parts with pins fairly away from each other. I've actually received the even newer 0.12 version in the mail, so I will transfer the components to it off screen. I can confirm that the USB 3 and HDMI ports are fully functional. After testing out the 0.12, I've made some changes to the design and ordered new prototypes. Each one of them has something else changed. This way I can test out what works and what doesn't. They may seem similar at first, but there are some changes in trace layouts and component placements. Each board has its own number in this corner, which will help me identify it later on. You can see here that the JLCPCB did a really great job in regard to quality. I love looking at the fresh boards. You can also see some empty spaces from which I've removed unneeded traces. The soldering process is exactly the same as in all other boards. I apply flux, add solder and then transfer the components. This time I've prepared two versions at once to speed up the process. I will solder the 0.2 version first, as this is the safer option. 0.3 is more experimental and it may not work at all. I will of course transfer all of the components from original board. This will ensure that there are no mistakes caused by replacement parts. Component transfer takes some practice to pull it off. Most of the parts are super tiny, so only hot air station will work. After soldering all of the components, original board goes straight to trash, as it won't be useful to me anymore. I've secretly replaced the board with 0.21 version. It's super similar to 0.2, but it has its own things going on. Just like before, I will test it out on my ROG Ally. Here you can see that both USB and HDMI connections work fine. Now that 0.21 is working, I can discard the 0.2 and focus on the 0.3. I've soldered the whole board off screen, so I won't bore you with soldering segment again. The USB cable has to be transferred from 0.21 as I don't have any spares. Those are super crappy and break a lot. I will use the exact same hardware for testing as in previous versions. Here you can see that USB connection works, but HDMI doesn't, which is really bad. I've soldered second 0.3 board to check if maybe my soldering is wrong. I honestly doubt that, but you'll never know. I've checked 0.2 again, just to make sure I didn't fry my ROG Ally, and it still works. So it seems that 0.21 is the latest version that works. 0.3 is obviously ready to be scrapped for parts. And that being said, thanks for watching everyone and see you in the next part, when I'm back with more mainboard prototypes.